Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Green Party to speak to this bill, which implements a very small part of the NZ-Korea Free Trade Agreement. Of course, these free trade agreements have very large-reaching consequences, but only very small elements of them actually require legislative change, and this bill implements those small elements. What these trade agreements are really about is what kind of global governance we want to have. The Green Party supports global governance. We want global rules around climate change emissions, for example. We want global rules around protecting people from cluster munitions, for example. The question is, when we implement these kind of trade agreements, the Korea Trade Agreement in this case, we are implementing a series of global rules. In this case, bilateral, in some cases multilateral, some cases plurilateral. And these kind of rules determine the way that the global order is to be rolled out. And so in these kind of agreements, and in this agreement in particular, there are the investor-state dispute settlement elements. It's part of this trade agreement that this bill is implementing a part thereof. And these trade agreements and these investor-state dispute settlement clauses, what they do is they restrict the ability of governments to regulate and of parliaments to pass laws. And so they restrict the scope of action of democratically elected parliaments. Because if you were to think, well, what are the kinds of rules for global governance we'd like to have in place? Should, for example, governments be allowed to eliminate nuclear power if they decide it's unsafe? I think that is a legitimate question of global governance. Should governments and parliaments be allowed to decide that they no longer want to have nuclear power? I think that is a legitimate question. And in my view, we should have a set of rules, a global governance, which enables and allows parliaments to decide to eliminate nuclear power. I just think that that is what the global rules should allow. The problem with investor-state dispute settlement clauses, which are part of the Korea-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, is that if you try to do that, you will be sued literally for billions of dollars. The reason why I can state that so confidently is that right now, at this very moment, the German government is being sued for billions of euros because they passed a law in their parliament to phase out nuclear power. And they're being sued under exactly these clauses, the investor-state dispute settlement clauses that are in this trade agreement. The German government is currently being sued by Vattenfall, which is a nuclear power company, because the German parliament dared to pass a law to phase out nuclear power. So the question is this: should the global governance rules that we establish prohibit democratically elected parliaments from phasing out nuclear power? My answer is yes. This bill's answer is no. And that's what it comes down to. Let's have another question. Should governments, democratically elected parliaments, be allowed to restrict tobacco advertising? For example, plain packaging of tobacco. Should you be allowed to do that? Should the rules of global governance allow parliaments to pass those rules? I say yes. This bill says no, because this bill implements the Korea-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, which includes investor-state dispute settlement clauses. What those clauses say is that if I remove Philip Morris, a tobacco company's right to use their intellectual property, which is their brand, they can sue me under investor-state dispute settlement clauses. The reason we know this is because Australia is currently being sued by Philip Morris under one of these clauses in a Hong Kong-Australia bilateral investment treaty, which has one of these clauses in it. And so I say, why would we support clauses that implement global governance rules that restrict our right to protect human health from tobacco companies? Why would you do that? So I don't support that. Let's take another example. What about if you wanted to restrict the sale of offshore land to offshore buyers? Now, I would say a democratically elected parliament should be allowed to pass a law to restrict the sale of land to people from offshore. It's not xenophobic, it's just simply saying we want to control the price of land in our country so that the people who live here can afford to buy it. Now, this bill before us right now is part of a trade deal that will prevent this parliament from passing a law that restricts the sale of land to offshore buyers. That's what this bill does right now. That's exactly what this bill does. Not only for Korea, but for China as well, because unfortunately the previous Labor government stupidly signed a free trade agreement which had a most favoured nation clause in it, which meant that any following government, like the one we have at the moment, that implemented really stupid trade agreements like this one, all of the impact of that would be pushed backwards onto the China-New Zealand free trade agreement. And that is, in fact, what this bill does. And I'm shocked the Labor Party is voting for this bill. I am shocked that the Labor Party is voting for a bill that they know will mean that we cannot place restrictions on the ability of people from Korea or from China about their ability to restrict the sale of land in New Zealand to offshore buyers. I listened to the debate, Mr Parker, very closely, and it was because the Labor government put a most favoured nation clause in the China-New Zealand FTA, and then this government introduced clauses that remove our right to stop offshore buyers of land, right? That right in this agreement, the one right before us, gets taken back into the Chinese one, the China-New Zealand one, because the Labor government put a most favoured nation clause into that agreement. So anyone who votes for this bill, Labor and National, you are voting to prevent this parliament from passing a law which says that New Zealand land has to stay in the ownership of New Zealand residents and citizens. That's what it means. Now, in my opinion, good global governance leaves the space for democratically elected parliaments to say the land in this country will be only sold to New Zealand residents and New Zealand citizens. I believe that they're good rules. Good global governance rules say if a parliament wants to do that, it should be allowed to do that. What this treaty does, and this bill which implements this treaty does, is it removes that right. I think that's bad global governance. That's why we're not going to be voting for it. I want to address there's so many elements to this thing. So let me just talk about that particular part of it, right? And there's a lot more to it. But that is all about restricting the ability of Parliament to A, prevent sales of land to offshore owners. If we wanted to eliminate nuclear power, we'd be prevented by doing that if we had it. If we wanted to restrict tobacco advertising, we would face big problems if we tried to do that because of this agreement, which those parties, Labor and National, are going to vote for tonight in this bill. Now let's talk about the China deal, because that's been brought up as an example of a great success. Now, there's an old saying in statistics that correlation is not causation. It is true that after the passage of the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement, the sale of dairy milk and logs to China increased very significantly. There is no question about that. The question is, was that caused by the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement? Is there a causal connection, or is it just a correlation? One way to examine this would be to say, well, let's look at other countries who are also selling products, particularly commodities, into China over that period that did not have free trade agreements. What about Australia, Brazil, South Africa? Also big commodity exporters. What happened to the commodity exports from New Zealand, Australia, Brazil and South Africa after the passage of the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement? None of those other countries had free trade agreements during that period. If you look at the exports from those other countries, they also dramatically increased after 2007-2008. They didn't have FTAs. So if the cause of the big increase in New Zealand's export to China was the FTA, why is it that those other commodity exporters also had dramatically larger increases in exports? So New Zealand roughly had a $4 billion increase. Australia had a $50 billion increase in terms of its exports into China. Brazil, $10 billion. South Africa, $30 billion. And so however you measure it, as a percentage or just in just basic numbers, all of those commodity exporters had a dramatic increase in their exports of simple commodities into China. And it had nothing to do with the FTA. China needed commodities because it had a booming economy. It's really simple. That is why our exports of simple commodities into China increased. That's why all countries like us who export simple commodities to China over that period had a huge growth. All of us had exactly the same experience. So yes, free trade agreements matter. Don't get me wrong, tariffs are a problem, right? I agree with that. But we should not have to sign up to removing all of our democratic rights to implement bad global governance in order to reduce tariff barriers. I don't agree with that. I think that that is a real problem because it restricts our democratic rights in the future and it creates real obstacles at a time when we need to take really coordinated action to reduce greenhouse emissions, clean up our waterways, a whole bunch of environmental problems that we face, not to mention what's going on with the Auckland house prices. When we need Parliament and government to have the tools in order to take that action, this Parliament, if it votes for this, is voting to take away those tools, and that's why we're not going to support it.
Fletcher Tabatone.